I really like Fire Emblem, as you can probably tell. But believe it or not, I have other interests beyond simply Fire Emblem, and one of those interests is Magic the Gathering. So, I thought it would be cool to imagine various Fire Emblem characters and items as Magic the Gathering cards, which is what this video is. Just my various fan interpretations of characters as Magic cards. Couple of disclaimers before we dive in. I'm not a card designer, so these are probably not going to be the most balanced or correctly formatted cards ever. I focused more on flavor than anything. So if something is wildly broken or wildly underpowered, I apologize in advance. I didn't make your favorite characters shit because I don't like them. I made them shit by accident. Also, I haven't played Magic the Gathering since before COVID-19, and even then, I primarily focused on the Legacy and Vintage formats, rather than anything Modern, Standard, or Commander, so it's possible there's some cards whose mechanics have already been done before, and I just didn't know that. There's so much Magic product these days that I really can't keep up with it all. I did do some research to try to make sure that I didn't print anything way too powerful, and kept myself updated on what keywords and various abilities were already in the game so I could make use of them, but I'm not perfect, so just be aware of that going forward. As far as which characters and items I made into cards, it was mostly just whatever I felt like, although I did also let my patrons submit characters and items, so some of the card choices were made by them. Basically, what I'm saying is if your character didn't make the final cut, I'm sorry. There's a lot of Fire Emblem characters, I couldn't include them all. But hey, maybe I'll do another one of these, and if that's the case, subscribe to Patreon and you too can submit characters. Alright, that's all the preamble out of the way, let's dive into the cards. Starting with my favorite archetype, the Jagans. Jagan, Aged Paladin, is a red 1-mana 1/1 with haste, and on ETB, you can search your library for a Silver Lance and place it onto the battlefield. Silver Lance being a 1-mana equipment that gives the equipped creature +3/+0 and has an equip cost of 2. However, it also has the keyword Limited Durability, which is an ability I created for this theoretical Fire Emblem set. And it allows you to attach an equipment to a creature for free. However, if you use Limited Durability, you must sacrifice the equipment at the beginning of the next end step. This ability is meant to counter-synergize with Jagan's downside, which is that you must sacrifice Jagan Aged Paladin whenever an equipment or aura is removed from him. So the idea is, if you want to use your Jagan very quickly, like a Jagan, then you have him search up the Silver Lance, auto-equip it to himself, and then attack for 4, but then Jagan falls off, by which I mean dies. And I further explored this idea of falling off with Aaron, Sickly Knight, who is a 0/0 creature that enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters. But at the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a +1/+1 counter from him, since he's dying from magical fantasy cancer, and will eventually whittle away. Unfortunately, the website I used to make these custom cards didn't know how to register a 0 power and toughness creature, so it just left the power and toughness box blank, but trust me, Aaron Sickly Knight is supposed to be a 0/0 creature whose power entirely comes from the +1/+1 counters on him. In contrast to these early game Jagans that fell off, I have Seth, the quintessential long-term Jagan, who is a 6-mana Selesnya creature with indestructible, trample, and protection from zombies and rogues, to represent the fact that he's not going to be stopped by any of the early game Sacred Stone's enemies. Additionally, whenever Seth attacks, if he is attacking alone, you may pay 1 white mana and give him Double Strike. Otherwise, you put a +1/+1 counter on each other creature you control. So Seth can either be your solo carry in Sacred Stones, or he can help to feed experience to your weaker units, represented by the +1/+1 counters. Seth's evil counterpart, Orson, was one of my favorite cards to design. When Orson enters the battlefield, an opponent of your choice gains control of him, and that opponent creates a 2/2 black zombie token, representing Monica. Orson, since he's a mad traitor, attacks each turn of Abel. And whenever Orson deals damage to a creature or player, his owner draws X cards, where X is half of the damage dealt rounded down. So, you give Orson to your opponent as a gift, and if your opponent makes any use of him, you gain cards. With the other evil Jagan, Gunter, I tried something different. I made him a 1 mana black 3/4 and had him give other creatures you control +2/+0, which is of course incredibly powerful and far above curve, but comes with a pretty restrictive downside. Because when Gunter enters the battlefield, if you cast him, you must sacrifice him. So in order to keep Gunter alive, you're going to have to pair him with some sort of reanimation or blink effect. Vander, in a similar vein, is another 1 mana creature with a pretty severe downside. He's a 3/2 who cannot attack or block unless he has 3 or less power. And I chose this effect specifically as a reference to the fact that Vander never fucking levels up in any of my playthroughs of Engage because for some reason the experience system in that game is remarkably slow for him. While this downside isn't a huge deal in the average game of Magic, I think it would actually matter in a draft setting for the Fire Emblem MTG set because I added in a pretty significant equipment and +1/+1 counter sub-theme to represent, well, equipment and experience. For example, the Killer Bow is an equipment that gives the equipped creature reach, and allows you to pay 2 to give the equipped creature double strike until end of turn, or pay 2 mana to give the equipped creature +1/+0 until end of turn. Meanwhile, the Silver Great Axe gives the equipped creature +10/+0, and creatures blocking this creature gain first strike, in a reference to Engage's Smash mechanic. It also removes unblockable from the equipped creature and prevents them from gaining equipped creature or untapping during their controller's untap step. And even though both SOV and Engage had unlimited durability, I gave these two equipments the limited durability keyword, if for no other reason than enabling some combo potential with the Silver Great Axe. Of course, not all equipments are going to give stat boosts. For example, the Brave Sword simply gives double strike, with limited durability. And Thani gives you protection from knights, as well as having the ability to sacrifice Thani to exile target knight. An ability that, once again, is not going to be super useful in most Magic the Gathering settings, but is designed for a draft format of Fire Emblem MTG because a lot of these creatures end up being knights. So this is just a 2 mana piece of colorless removal. Sticking with the equipment theme, I decided to include Sigurd's iconic Tyrfing, which gives +4/+4 in first strike, as well as the limited durability keyword. However, I gave it the clause that when Tyrfing is destroyed, you may return it to your hand. So, if you use the limited durability keyword, then Tyrfing is not permanently destroyed, only temporarily destroyed. Which I intended as a reference to the fact that Fire Emblem 4's durability can always be repaired with gold, even when a weapon reaches 0. On the opposite end of the spectrum, I also made an equipment for one of the weakest weapons in Fire Emblem history, the Biting Blade, which is an artifact food equipment, and I believe this is the first food equipment that Magic the Gathering has had. So that's pretty cool, if nothing else. Although, not all of the equipments I put in this set were modeled after Fire Emblem weapons, because I also included the 12 Emblem Rings as a sort of alternate win condition if you collect all 12 of them. These are each 1-cost equipments with an equip cost of 1 that give the equipped creature a variety of powers themed around the specific emblem ring. But if you control all 12 of them, you win the game. In order of appearance, Marth's Ring gives Vigilance, since it literally gives a skill called Vigilance. Sigurd's Ring gives horsemanship, which is an old Portal 3 Kingdoms keyword, because Sigurd is on a horse. Celica's Ring gives Ward 1. Micaiah's Ring gives lifelink for obvious reasons. Roy's Ring gives +2/+2 since Emblem Roy boosts your character's level. Leaf's Ring gives Vantage, which is the equivalent of First Strike in my opinion. Lucina's Ring gives Indestructible and Defender as a reference to Bondage Shield. Lynn's Ring gives Reach as a reference to her bows because as we all know, Lynn is a bow lord. Ike's Ring gives Trample, which just felt appropriate for the guy who literally breaks walls. Byleth's Ring gains Tap, target creature gains +2/+2, as a reference to Byleth being a teacher. Corrin's Ring gains Menace, because dragons are pretty menacing. And Erica's Ring gives Death Touch, since Erica's Ring is just really good at killing people. And I even included a commander who is meant to interact with this win condition, because Sombron, Rin-Seeking Monarch, is a 4-mana 4/4 with Death Touch and the ability to tap and pay 1 life to search your library for an equipment with 1 CMC or less, reveal it, and place it on the battlefield attached to Sombron. You could, of course, just have a toolbox of a bunch of different 1-mana equipments, but from a flavor perspective, Sombron is trying to collect all 12 rings in order to destroy the world, so, flavor win. Of course, if you'd rather play as Engage's protagonist, I also gave Alir a card. Obviously, I started by making him a blue-red creature in reference to Alir's iconic hairdo, but I also gave him Flash, Haste, and when Alir enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an artifact with CMC 3 or less, and if you do, reveal it and add it to your hand. Alir also gets Tap, target creature gains +3/+1 until end of turn, and creatures you control gain +X/+X, where X is the number of equipments attached to Alir. I'll be honest, I might have overcooked a little bit with this one. That seems like a lot for just 3 mana, but I wanted to give reference to Alir's personal skill as a valuable support unit, as well as give Alir a reason to be an alternate commander for the 12 rings. Maybe I should have just given Alir 2 different cards, but I saved that privilege for one of my favorite characters, Titania. And I justified it in my head as an early game Titania and a late game one, in reference to her 2 appearances in Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. The 2-mana version of Titania is a 3/3 with protection from rogues, and whenever another mercenary enters the battlefield under your control, place X +1/+1 counters on that creature, where X is Titania's power. Meanwhile, the 5-mana Titania is a Bant creature, and when Titania enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 red mercenary token with haste. Whenever a creature that was dealt damage by Titania this turn dies, you choose to either put 2 +1/+1 counters on Titania, or put 1 +1/+1 counter on each other mercenary you control. And you can tap and pay a rent to have Titania fight a creature you don't control, as well as having her tap to give a creature with less power than her indestructible until end of turn. So this sort of threads the needle between Titania soloing the game and Titania training up other units, sort of similar to what I did with Seth. I considered giving my other favorite Jagan, Marcus, the 2-card treatment, but instead decided to make him a transforming creature. So what I came up with was Marcus Veteran Knight, who is a 2-mana 2/2 with haste, and whenever Marcus attacks, he gains a +1/+1 counter. Then, if his power is 6 or greater, remove all counters and transform him into Marcus Elder Knight, who is a 1/1 with first strike. And when Marcus transforms, you may put an equipment from your hand onto the battlefield, referencing the fact that in Binding Blade, Marcus kind of relies on stuff like the Silver Lance and Killer Axe to actually output decent damage, as opposed to in FE7, where he just dominates the game with the basic hand axe. And of course, with Marcus bringing transforming cards out of the bag, you know we got to include some Lagoos. such as Nyla, Queen of the Wolves, a 6-mana 5/4 wolf with first strike, trample, and ward 1. Whenever Nyla enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 wolf token, and other wolves you control gain +1/+1. However, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may transform Nyla into Nyla Mysterious Stranger, who has Ward X, where X is the number of wolves you control, and gives other wolves you control +2/+2. Additionally, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may transform Nyla. The reason I allowed Nyla to transform basically whenever she wants is she has the ability to do that in Radiant Dawn. But unlike Radiant Dawn, I wanted to give her a reason to remain in human form instead of wolf form. So I made her 2 shapes, the choice between a powerful combat creature or a powerful utility creature, buffing wolves and protecting herself, or just buffing wolves a little bit and attacking for a lot of damage. I did also create some generic Laguz dragons, wolves, and birds to sort of fill out the Laguz portion of the draft, but in the end I decided they were kind of boring since they weren't named characters, so I didn't end up putting them into the card generator. Although I did add a couple of cards referencing non-named characters, such as Green Unit Tactics, which is a fog equivalent. For 1 green mana, you get X 1/1 green human knights, where X is the number of creatures attacking you. However, you must sacrifice them at the end of combat. So, much like green units in actual Fire Emblem, they're really only good as fodder. An alternative combat trip is Weapon Triangle Advantage, which, as you can expect, gives 1 creature +2/+0 and 1 creature -2/+0. Just like the regular Weapon Triangle. The last non-creature card I want to talk about is Benched, which is an enchantment aura that prevents enchanted creature from untapping. However, anyone can sacrifice a creature in order to destroy Benched, as a reference to the fact that once a unit is benched, if one of your real units dies, you might find room for them on the team again. But let's get back to talking about the characters, who are, let's be honest, the coolest thing about Fire Emblem. Such as Lyn, who is a 3-mana 3/2 with haste, and when Lyn, Lady of the Plains, enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a legendary equipment card, reveal it, and add it to your hand. Additionally, you may tap Lyn and pay a green mana to destroy target creature with less power than Lyn. And Lyn is meant to combo with the Mani Kari, which is a 1-mana legendary equipment that grants +2/+0. However, if the equipped unit has haste, they also gain an additional +2/+0. And of course, it has limited durability, because Fire Emblem 7 has limited durability. Of course, while the Mani Kari is traditionally Lyn's weapon, she's not the only card I created that can benefit from this legendary equipment, as both Odin and Ophelia have equipment-based abilities in Fates, so I gave them equipment-based abilities in Magic the Gathering. Odin, much like Lyn, searches for a legendary equipment whenever he enters the battlefield. He gains +1/+1 for each equipment attached to him, and an additional +1/+1 for each legendary equipment attached to him, meaning that the legendary equipment you tutor up will already boost him by 2/2 all on its own. Ophelia, on the other hand, has a different twist on the Equipment Matters wizard, as she gains +1/+1 for each equipment attached to her, and when she has 5 or more equipment, she gains Double Strike. Additionally, equip costs 1 less when equipping to Ophelia, in order to allow her to reach that dreaded 5 threshold faster. Of course, the Mani Kari couldn't possibly be the only legendary equipment I add to this set, as I also brought in Marth's Falchion, which gives +7/+7 vigilance and protection from dragons, as a reference to the Falchion in FE1 being kind of bonkers busted, although ironically, it actually protects from everything except for dragons in that game. Speaking of dragons, let's talk about Myrrh, the last dragon, who is a 3-mana 3/3 with flying, protection from zombies, dragons, centaurs, cyclops, and demons, and a new keyword I added, Training Project, which is whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, place a +1/+1 counter on it, in reference to the fact that Myr is, well, a training project, which is a common unit type in Fire Emblem. So common, in fact, that I wasn't able to include all the ones I wanted. But a couple of highlights are Emilia, good in general, and Est, cheerful flyer. Est is a 1/1 flyer with Training Project, who gains Vigilance if she has 3 or more counters on her, and Double Strike if she has 7 or more counters on her. Meanwhile, Emilia is a double striking 0/1 with Training Project. So if you want to train her up, you are going to have to give her some equipment, because otherwise she can't deal damage to the enemy player. However, if you are able to get her to the point where she has 10 +1/+1 counters on her, she gains Indestructible. Truly the zero to hero experience that Emilia fans desire. Of course, we can't really have a Training Project keyword without also including everybody's favorite, Donald, who is a 1-mana 2/1 with First Strike, Training Project, and if he has 3 or more 1/1 counters on him, he gains Lifelink. Of course, on the opposite end of the Awakening basis growth spectrum is Frederick, Guardian Shepherd, a 3-mana 3/2 with Flash, First Strike, and the ability to sacrifice himself to give target creature hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Which I meant as a reference to the fact that Frederick will sacrifice himself to save Crom and Lissa if need be. Speaking of creatures that are helping others rather than doing the combat themselves, I made Nils, Mysterious Performer, tap and pay mana to boost a creature's power and lower its toughness. Which is basically my way of asking, is anyone in my audience old enough to remember Aetherling? Because Aetherling was pretty baller back in the day. Next up, we have Hawkeye, Desert Guardian, a 5/3 with Flash, as a reference to the fact that he appears out of nowhere in a sandstorm. And when Hawkeye enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a card, reveal it, and add it to your hand. If it's not an equipment, you take damage equal to its CMC. I struggled for a while to think of a good mechanical output for Hawkeye as a Crypt Berserker, and decided instead to focus on his Join map, which is a desert map with hidden items. And since Hawkeye shows up out of nowhere, he can pretty easily help you find these desert items, while Pent is kicking ass on the other end of the map. Another Patreon request I struggled with for a bit was Arthur, Wrathful Mage, who eventually I settled on being a 2/2 who gets a 1/1 counter anytime he gains damage, as a sort of reference to how Wrath boosts Arthur's power based on the damage he takes. I considered giving him First Strike or something like that in reference to the Vantage Wrath combo, but in the end decided against giving him any canonical mother, since FE4 lets you choose whatever mom for Arthur you desire. Just for fun, I also created a card for the other Arthur from Fates, and he's really fucking bad. You flip coins every time he attacks, and if you ever lose a coin flip, he dies and deals damage to you instead of the opponent. This is purely meant to be a flavor thing. Arthur is pretty bad, no questions asked. Next up, we have Lapis, Potato Goddess, a 3-mana 2/3 with Vigilance, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you create a food token. Whenever you sacrifice a food, create a 2/2 green bear token. The only factoids I know about Lapis are her obsession with potatoes and the fact that she fights bears. So I decided to take these 2 factoids and turn her into a Food Matters commander. Although considering The Hobbit has recently given us some bear tribal cards, the bear tokens might also be a useful sub-theme. Next up, another transforming card, Charlotte Ladylike Bachelorette, is a 1/1 who can transform if she is the only creature you control. And when she does, she becomes a 3/3 with Trample, Vigilance, +2/+2 for each creature your opponents control, and the ability to pay red and give her +1/+0 until end of turn. However, if another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you must transform Charlotte back into her ladylike bachelorette form. This is meant to be a reference to the fact that Charlotte acts all ladylike and timid when around people, but unmasks herself when there are no suitable suitors around, in order to become, well, unmasked. I don't think this card would necessarily be particularly good, but I'm really proud of it from a flavor perspective, capturing Charlotte's personality in Magic the Gathering form. Similarly, I'm very happy with my Anna Secret Cellar, which is a sort of pack rat-esque creature. You can have any number of cards named Anna Secret Cellar in your deck, and Anna Secret Cellar ignores the legend rule. Whenever she enters the battlefield, you create a treasure token for each card named Anna Secret Cellar you control. However, whenever you sacrifice a treasure, you lose 1 life. So, Anna makes you a bunch of treasures, but really doesn't want you to spend your money because, well, it's Anna. Of course she doesn't. And since Anna functions as a pack rat, this ability both gets stronger and more punishing the more Annas you have, as you will create more and more treasures, but also lose life for every single Anna anytime you crack one of those treasures. It's kind of devious. Next up is Hilda, Lazy Schoolgirl, a 3-mana 5/2 with Defender, as a reference to the fact that Hilda really doesn't want to do work, which in this case would be attacking. However, the first time you attack with 3 or more creatures each turn, you may untap all creatures you control and take an extra combat step, and units with Defender may attack during extra combat steps, which is meant to represent Hilda reluctantly participating once others have done the majority of the work. This could theoretically enable a Defender Matters strategy, but honestly, I don't think it would. Most of the time, getting units with Defender to attack isn't going to do much. Hilda is kind of the exception in that regard. But that's enough talking about heroes, because Fire Emblem also has some iconic villains, and I made a few of them as well, such as Ashura, the Goddess of Order. She is a 6-mana 2/4 that gives all creatures you control +0/+1. And when she enters the battlefield, you get 8/0/0 enchantment creatures named Ashura's Aura, with Defender, and whenever this creature takes damage from any source, deal that much damage to the source's controller. Additionally, you can pay a white mana and sacrifice an enchantment to make target opponent silenced until end of turn, but you can only do this anytime you could cast a sorcery. So it's meant to be protection for your attempt at comboing off, rather than a sort of prison effect locking your opponents out of the game. Another control-centric villain I created is Julius, Scion of Loptis, who is a 6-mana black 2/2 with, when Julius enters the battlefield, you may search your library for the Book of Loptis, reveal it, and put it into your graveyard. You can also pay 1 and a red to select 2 creatures you do not control and force them to fight, as a reference to the child fights that Julius forced under his reign. And whenever another creature dies, you lose 2 life and draw a card, which you can manipulate with Julius's child fights to give you 2 cards for 2 mana, potentially. As for the Book of Loptis, it is a limited durability equipment that grants the equipped creature indestructible. And if it is in your graveyard, you can pay a black mana to return it to the battlefield so long as you control a demon, which conveniently Julius is. Of course, I can't just create the Book of Loptis without creating its opposite, the Book of Naga, which is an equipment that grants +2/+2 and the ability to tap that creature in order to exile target demon. Specifically, the Book of Naga is created to kill Julius, so the fact it can exile him, going through the indestructible that Loptis gives him, feels like a flavor win to me. Of course, the books of Naga and Loptis were not the only iconic duos I made Magic cards for. And that brings us to the final keyword I introduced for Fire Emblem Magic the Gathering. And that is partners with Red and Green Cav. That's right, I made the Christmas Cavaliers into a partner mechanic. The general idea was you can combine any green cav with any red cav, so the pool of options is limited but flexible. And I'll start by talking about the classic Kain and Abel, both of whom I made into red units. Abel Lovestruck Traitor is a 4/4 with haste for 2 mana, but when Abel enters the battlefield, target opponent gains control of him until the end of their next turn. And this is intended to be a reference to Abel's Fire Emblem 3 appearance, where he turns traitor to Marth temporarily because Est is held hostage. Meanwhile, the red cav equivalent, Kain, is called Kain Loyal Soldier, and he is a 2 mana 2/2 with haste that gives humans you control +1/+0. Very bland and boring, but honestly, Kain is pretty bland and boring. And I figured boosting humans made sense, since he sided with Marth against the dragons. From the Binding Blade, I have Alan Rash Knight and Lance Tactical Knight. Alan continues in the Cav tradition of being a hasty knight, as he is a 1 mana 1/1 with haste. However, he gains +1/+1 for each creature you control with haste. Which means he's just a strictly better Goblin Guide, which was a little bit of an oversight on my part. I probably should have made him scale off of only other creatures you control with haste, but whatever. This is a clever reference to the fact that Wizards doesn't balance for 60-card commander formats anymore. Cough Fantasticar, cough. Meanwhile, Lance Tactical Knight is a 3 mana white 2/4. With Defender, and whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures with haste, you choose how which creatures block this turn, and how those creatures block. This effect was first introduced on Audric, Master Tactician, and Lance is probably a weaker version of him, but that makes sense considering the flexibility partner offers. From Fire Emblem 7, I have Sane, Reckless Womanizer, and Kent, Stern Protector. Sane is a 3 mana 3/2 with haste, and the first time Sane deals damage to a player each turn, you may search your library for a creature with CMC X or less, where X is the damage he dealt. If you do, reveal it and add it to your hand. And of course, you get extra flavor bonus points if that creature is a woman, such as Lynn, who is technically fetchable by Sane. Meanwhile, Kent, Stern Protector, is a white 3 mana 2/3 who can tap to give target creature with less power than Kent indestructible and hexproof until end of turn. Then place a +1/+1 counter on that creature. This is a reference to Kent's protective nature, and the fact that he takes his duty of guarding and training Lady Lynn extremely seriously. Our Sacred Stone representatives are Kyle, Dutiful Retainer, and Ford, Carefree Painter. Kyle is a green 3 mana 2/2 who enters the battlefield or attacks. You may return a creature you control from your hand, and if you do, you gain 5 life and get a 1/1 counter on Kyle, Dutiful Retainer. Meanwhile, Ford, Carefree Painter, is a 2 mana 1/2 with Vigilance and the ability to tap to create an artifact named Painting. The painting is worthless, but I guess you can cope that it has artifact synergies. Look, I'm not gonna lie, I made Ford bad on purpose. I consider that in and of itself to be a flavor win. From Tellius, I have Oscar, the Mercenary Chef, and Kieran, Energetic Knight. Oscar is a 2 mana 2/1, and when he enters the battlefield, you create X food tokens, where X is the amount of mana you spent on Oscar. Then, whenever you sacrifice a food, you put a +1/+1 counter on Oscar. Meanwhile, Kieran is a 2 mana 4/3 with haste and first strike, but whenever he attacks, you need to flip a coin. And if you win the flip, Kieran gains +X/+0, where X is his power. But if you lose the flip, Kieran deals 4 damage to you and sets his power to 0. Despite the fact that Kieran looks like a sort of fixed version of the Arthur card, I actually made his card before Arthur's. It's just that, much like with Ford, I kinda made Arthur bad on purpose. But I saved the most powerful pair of Christmas Cavaliers for last. Because straight out of Thracia, I have Alva Lance Knight and Kain Lance Knight, each of whom are 2-mana 2/2s for a white and a green. I know, going a little bit crazy with these ones, but can you blame me? Thracia itself is kind of a crazy game. With that being said, that's all the Magic cards I got for you today. So it's time to thank my patrons. Thank you to Jay, Logs, Glup Shido, Erica Ford, Perg Knight, YLO1, George Grenville, the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Arvis, Floahay, Amy Hazel, Hungry Hearts, Hound Dogs, Burnt to Cinders, Crimson Claw, Fork King, Sarah, Ryu Mao, Madden Craves, Ziggy WSB, Derek, Shinthia, Faulty Videos, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Anna Cabana, The Daily Fugal, Faye, Magic Bite, Thoughtful Insanity, Robin Goodfeller, JT Spritter, Laura Hunter, Jonathan Durbin, Dragonback Lancer, Violet, Psych, Chris, Root Bear Pants, Queen Eliza, Control Tages, Roman Gramantic, Nick Knack Hammersmack, Angel Nap Caceres, Zanwiff, Not Gino, Name Number 5, Squid Stats, Big Fan of Bishop Clement, Flingon, Edward C., Caius, Cole, Cabbage, Bree, Punch Fighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Sardonic News, Wesley Toma, Sensitive Luigi, Rage, Dr. Frying Pan, Toon, Turzy P, Judah Mage, Femto Illness, Wannabe Cinnabon, Key the Iron Idol, Saren Galaxy, Rezi, Dino Anna, Alex Erie, Andu, Rhea, Gameboo, Carosa, Fyrant, Your Doctor, KH, Siggy MC, Girl Boss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Jaden, Dylan Solis, Some Trades, Celery Whore, Smaz Ruby, Robin D, Alenby, They Thom, Clan, Pillow Willow, Gabe the Green, Guiji555, Kristen Nail, and especially my Jagans, Meredith Bacon, and Wild Card. And I am out of breath, so if you want to add to my vocal struggles, there is a link to the Patreon down below, but please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. Otherwise, free ways to support the channel include liking, subscribing, commenting, etc, etc. And speaking of comments, why don't you comment your own Magic cards down below, if you're still with me. Alright, that's it. Toodles. Bye-bye. Stay safe, gamers.